Whenever I get a question about my most favorite audio processing plugins, I very often recommend FabFilter stuff. And a lot of the time, someone else will come in and say, you don't need to get that, that's expensive, you can do with something else. And you know what? Chances are that you already own a DAW that has everything you could possibly ask for. And most of the time, the real limitation is your own knowledge level, your own skills, and your own creativity. So why do I keep going to FabFilter? Well, you see, I have invested a copious amount of time the past 30 to 35 years into learning how sound works and how to use tools to produce the types of sounds that I like. You see, there's nothing more fun for me than sitting down for 8 hours straight tweaking synthesizers or making synth patches in a filter plugin. I love sound design, and this is the reason to why I keep going back to FabFilter plugins, because very rarely do I feel like I'm limited in their plugins. So there is a lot of patch building inside Twin 3. It does expect you to invest a lot of time into it. However, it is very, very easy to build macros. Drag, drop, drag, drop, drag, drop. Press over here to flip it around. Drag it this way to flip it around. If you want stuff to work unipolarly or bipolarly, it doesn't really matter. The freedom of being able to modulate almost everything in here any way you want and doing it with a quick interface like this with a drag and drop is so empowering, especially if you're into sound design. Now, I am a sound designer and sometimes I sell some of my presets over at Gumroad, and that is the case for Twin 3. There is an entire preset pack available over at my Gumroad. It contains 101 presets, and you've already heard a few of those presets in this video. But not only that, for those of you who picked up Buzzone, there is now a Neuro and drum and bass style preset pack also available over at my Gumroad. Now, people who subscribe to my Patreon never have to pay extra for these preset packs. I always put them at Patreon so that you can download them directly. By the way, hello there, my beautiful viewers, and welcome to attaQ. My name is Jakob. I'm your host, and you're watching a attaQ episode. Alright, so before I begin, I just want to say that my next two bits of critique are completely iOS related. So they might not make any sense to anyone watching this who are using laptop and desktop systems. The touchscreen is one of the biggest reasons I like the iOS platform so much. I get to interact with my software through a touch interface. And I really like that, especially when the apps I'm using are made for touch. And nothing irks me more than when an app is not really well made for touch. And I'm sure that FabFilter has done their absolute best in order to make their laptop and desktop ports feel really good with touch on iOS, but they don't. So I want to say thank you, FabFilter, for putting your excellent stuff on iOS. I have used a lot of stuff in my years, and you make some of the absolute best. On the other hand, you for forcing me to use something like this for hours and hours straight. You have no idea how much I hate using input devices like these, but you kind of need them. Yeah, I am highly recommending getting yourself a precision input device like either a mouse or a pencil when you want to work with FabFilter stuff. Now, in my case, it has been a mouse because I hate using pens or pencils even more. And it gets even harder to use them when you don't have one of those screen protectors that has a texture like paper, because your pen will slide around when you're trying to do like intricate setups and things like that. So yeah, I do recommend using a mouse. It is a good compromise because FabFilter plugins are really good. My next bit of criticism has to do with the envelope follower and the sidechain mode inside the envelope generator. Both of these are amazing to have inside a synth because it allows you to do some dynamic modulation based on some other parts of audio somewhere else in your project. But here we can't use them. And the reason to that is because up to this date, there are no DAWs or AUV3 hosts on iOS that actually supports external sidechain input for instruments. It would have been different if Twin 3 was an effect plugin, because in that case, there is support for external sidechain, but it's not. It is an instrument. So there's not really much we can do. We have to hope that developers making AUV3 hosts and DAWs implement external sidechain support for instruments. And this is actually something that is available to developers. And I think that if they did, then more instrument developers would actually utilize that input, not only for putting envelope followers in their synth, but other ways of layering sounds and making control signals. Yeah, it would be a cool thing to have there. Now, I have been using Twin 3 for over a year, and in all that time, I haven't really felt the need for an envelope follower or the sidechaining feature for the envelope generator. So I've been perfectly fine just using everything that is in there, and I've had a lot of fun, and I've been able to build a lot of patches, and I put 100 of the best ones into my preset pack that you can go and get if you want more sounds. And speaking of more sounds, Twin 3 is compatible with Twin 2 patches that you can find online and download. And so there are a lot of great sounds already in Twin 3 when you get it, and then you can get some more sounds. But every time you're loading a patch that might have a sidechaining feature turned on for the envelope generator, or maybe an envelope follower in there, the patch will still load. It will still work. It's just that it won't sound right. Now, Twin 3 is a virtual analog synthesizer, meaning it is software, it is digital. However, FabFilter has worked hard at trying to make it sound analog. And one way they've been doing that is by making the pitch drift. And as you can see here, it has a really weird drift pattern. By the way, I've sped up the footage. It doesn't really move this fast in real time. Now, that's just one way of making stuff sound analog. They've added some other ways of doing some analog-y type things here. Because if we look at the voicing section, we have three options. We got monophonic, and then we've got polyphonic, but then we have a paraphonic per oscillator mode. We can have up to 4 oscillators at any given time in any patch. And if we choose the per oscillator mode, it will basically spread out our notes over these 4 oscillators. Now, the synth is a modern synth, so they have added a unison voice, which works for every one of these modes. So yeah, even the paraphonic mode can stack voices through the unison mode. And by the way, the unison knob here, where you're spreading out the pitch, is fully modulatable, which is super cool when you're using an envelope on it or something like that. Now, on top of this, there is a very strong subtractive section in this synth. And what they've done here is pretty cool, because it's like they've taken the heart of what makes Pro Q3 so good, cut that out, and then smashed it right into Twin 3. Here you have a wide selection of filter styles, filter slopes, and filter shapes. And you can mix them any way you want in up to 4 nodes. So yeah, all of the filter nodes, their parameters, their stereo spread, their cue points, all of it can be modulated individually and have their own unique modulations. But if you just want to move them all at once, then you've got the filter cutoff here and resonance, which will move all of the filters in unison. And this is of course also modulatable. On top of this, you've got routing modes. You got a serial and a parallel, which is pretty bread and butter. But then you have a per oscillator mode, which is pretty cool when you're doing a per oscillator mode for the filter section and a per oscillator voicing mode, because it's like playing 4 monosynths at once with the ability to have a unison mode on top of it. And all of the oscillators, all of the voices can have their own unique filter that you set up yourself and their own unique modulation. Now, if we actually take a look at the oscillators, you can do some nice synthesis right on them. They come packed with bread and butter waveforms, but they do have some interesting ones, such as the triangle pure and square pure, which are basically just richer in harmonic content, but they're still triangle and square. So they will sound different from the other ones. Now, on top of that, you got white and pink noise, and then you have a hard sync mode for all of the oscillators. The square, of course, has a pulse width modulation. All of the oscillators have their own panning and their own volume knob, and you can of course modulate all of this. So you can do a combo of modulation of the panning, the volume, the pitch, the sync mode, the pulse width mode. It is pretty nice what you can do just with oscillator modulation. Now, there is actually a ring modulator mode in here, and to get access to that, you need 2 oscillators, because one oscillator is being used to ring modulate the other one. Now, I do want to add also that you can do a bit of AM synthesis. It's not fully AM synthesis because the LFOs cannot go up into the thousands of hertz. However, they do get up into the audible range because they can do up to 500 hertz. Now, on top of all of this, you have a great sounding FX section with a pretty nice selection of effects. You've got a smooth sounding FabFilter reverb algorithm in here. It's got a darker mode and a brighter mode. Yeah, it just sounds great. Now, if we look at the delay section, there is a lot more going on because the filter section is just as interesting as it is in the main synth. Look at this. We can select between different styles, different slopes, and different shapes. And being able to mix them like this and also modulate them inside the delay is pretty awesome. But the dopest function here is definitely the routing options for the filters inside the delay. Yeah, you can find them in the upper left corner here. And here there is one very interesting option called per delay. effect section doesn't stop there because we've got a nice chorus section, a phaser flanger section, and then there is the drive. And this one is very interesting because it feels as if we've got a bit of Saturn 2 in here too. So, what happens is the drive will sound differently depending on where along the scale you put it. So there are some definite sweet spots. It definitely changes character as you drive it up. All the way up here, it sounds very punk. While down here, it sounds more saturated. It is so nice to have so many options just on one knob. Lastly, what I want to mention is the limiter. And there, I just mentioned it. It's really rudimentary. And then the main volume for the synth is hidden, and I hate that. It's down here, and you actually have to tap this tab to get the main volume up. So annoying. Well, either way, I've shown you the main features of the synth, but what I haven't shown you is the most powerful thing in the synth, and that is the modulation section. It is very, very strong. So we have up to 100 modulation slots for intricately stacked routings with switchable polarity. And when it comes to the modulation sources, well, in this patch here, I have added all of the modulation sources that you can use in a patch at any given time. And there's quite a few of them. But if we look down here, we can see that I've added 6 touch surfaces, and these can be either sliders or XY controllers, or just one of the types, but you can have up to 6. And if your setups starts getting a little bit crowded, like it is in this one, we can actually close this down on this button over here, and that way we'll only have access to the macro controllers that we want to use. Next, I have added the maximum amount of LFOs we can use, which is 6, and these LFOs are super powerful. After that, we've got 5 envelope generators, and there's actually 6 because the amp envelope is also usable for modulation. Next, we get to a few options that won't be available for iOS users because of what I said in the critique section, and those are the envelope followers, but we can have up to 4 of them. Well, if we move on from there, we can also have up to 10 MIDI sources, which can be a mix of, velocity, aftertouch, and CC controllers. But yeah, as you can see, there are a lot of options available for setting up modulations. Now, where can we send all of this? Well, it turns out that there are hundreds of destinations inside Twin 3 because everything inside the oscillator section, filter section, effect section, main volume section, unison section, it can all be modulated. And then you can, of course, modulate all of the destinations inside the modulation sources themselves. And then on top of that, you can modulate modulation slots. So you can stack modulation on top of modulation on top of modulation. So there are hundreds. I haven't counted them all. Now, there is actually a way of overviewing modulation slots, and you can get to this place from anywhere where you've got modulation set up. But yeah, you have to have modulation set up, and then you open this up, you have this little box here, and then you go to the right side, and you have to get it exactly right because otherwise you'll be tapping on something else. You might delete something. It's super annoying, but here there should be an arrow, and there we go. Here we have all of the slots, and here you can see what I've done in this patch. And if we scroll down here, we should get to some empty ones, but I do have patches where there's not even one slot over because I've just modulated so much. we're going to have a look at the extremely powerful XLFOs. But first, there is a way of actually scaling and changing the polarity for a modulation source output. And you do it with the outer ring here by just tapping down and dragging it around. And normally these are set to 1, which would be like 1 octave. If you controlled something like a pitch, then you could do a 1 octave of pitch modulation. But you can actually do double the amount of output by dragging it up to 2 like this. And this works both ways, so you can even change the polarity like that. Now, there is a way of actually changing the rate for an LFO right from the box here by dragging up and down. And I don't like this because I often do this by mistake. And I wish there was a way to turn it off, but there isn't. So be careful with that. Now, you open up these windows by pressing here on the box, and inside here, we can find a bunch of things. But there is a drawback here because some of the shaping you do can't really be seen until you exit the box. For instance, right now we are gonna keep all the settings as they are, but I'm just gonna take this and drag it this way. And as you can see here, we have somewhat of a ramp down here and ramp up here. Well, we can't see anything happening here. However, if we go out of the box, we can see that we have now actually reshaped it to look way more like a ramp down saw, even though it's a bit curved. But that's because if we open this up and look at these steps here, then we can see that we've got sine waveform selected here. However, if we switch these out for instance, linear, I love this, and we back out again, we can see that we have a ramp down saw. It's no longer curved. Now, we can actually switch these out to more interesting shapes, like a square triangle. And this is so nice, especially if we recenter this, which gives us a square. However, since we've got this one over here, then if we look, it is actually not a square. This is the drawback of the system. Sometimes you can't see it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna recenter this, and now we can see that there is a square here. However, I did switch this out to a square triangle, so when I slew it, we're getting this shape instead, which is kind of like a shark fin. And the cool thing is that if we wanted this to be unipolar, we just do that, and now it's unipolar positive. If we wanted it to be negative, we do it like that, and there you go. If we wanted to just invert it, there you go again, we've just flipped it upside down. And if we want to change the face, well, we just grab over here and we do that, and now we've pushed the face forward. If we wanted to do even more wave shaping with more weird curves in it, we could just add some steps here and reshape it any way we want. Recurve this one like that, maybe this one like that, pull it up here, do that, add another step, do this, do that, and then go out of here and look at that waveform. And we can use this to modulate whatever we want. And in this case, I'm just gonna drag it up to the cutoff. And now we have this really, really weird shape here. Now, on top of all of this, we have a random mode, and since you can switch out the curving for it, you can skew it any way you want, you can have it work either as a sample and hold, or you can have it work as something more akin to a Perlin type noise for some interesting randomness. Now, on top of that, this thing can be synced, and you also have some retriggering options. And if you wanted to work with, for instance, pitch, then there is a quantization option here. And now you can scale this to pitches, which is super, super nice. Now, when it comes to the steps, you can have up to 16 of them. So you can even get into doing some drum tracks and stuff. Next up, we're gonna have a look at the modulation envelopes. A word of warning though, because you can change the shape and time of them by dragging up and down and sideways, and I've done this by mistake. But then again, you do have an undo and a redo, so if you end up doing an do in the synth, you can undo the doing by pressing undo. So we're gonna open up the attaQ envelope, and attaQ is a great name for this type of envelope. It basically is a shortening of the stages. So we got a delay, which goes up to 5 seconds, and then we've got up to 25 seconds of attaQ. After that, we have 25 seconds of decay, and then we've got the sustain stage, which goes the whole way of the amp scale. And then after that, we have 20 seconds of hold, which is nice. And this basically just holds the note after you've released it before it goes into the 25-second long release stage. There's a whole lot of time for you to modulate sounds with. Now, when it comes to the attaQ, the decay, and the release stage, these are curvable in both exponential and logarithmic ways. So you can curve them any way you want, and all of these points are modulatable, which is super, super nice. And something I like doing is adding a bit of LFO on the sustain and then using velocity modulation to basically make the attaQ longer and longer the further up I go in octave, which is also a nice way of making expressive sounds. I just love having so much power in one thing. Now, the cool thing here is that right now, the envelope basically is a unipolar envelope. So it goes from 0 to 1. And if we want to reverse it or invert it, we could just turn this around like this. And now we have an inverted envelope. However, there is also a way of making this envelope work in a bipolar way. By going over here, we have two options. Normal, which it is right now, but then we have neutral sustain. And basically, when we switch it to this, you can view it as a bipolar envelope. So now we have -1 down here and +1 up here. And we can set the 0 point by using the sustain like this. This is super awesome. I just love being able to do this. Now, if you end up building any intricate setups for the LFOs or maybe the envelopes, then you can always save your settings by just pressing on this arrow down here where you have saving options. And as you can see, there are already some presets for the envelopes that ships with Twin 3. Now, when it comes to the envelope followers, there's not much I can do inside Twin 3 because we don't have an audio input. But I can show you really quickly what it does inside something like Timeless. Basically, it just listens to the audio input and then it translates that into a control signal that you can use to modulate certain things with. It's great for modulating stuff like drive and things like that. So on desktop, you'll have loads of fun with it. On iOS, not so much. Now, there are more ways of controlling stuff inside Twin 3. And so if we press here on the plus sign, we can see that we've got a list of MIDI sources. Now, a few of them have already been added here, but here we've got mod wheel, pitch bend, velocity, aftertouch, and keyboard tracking. And these are great for keyboard players who want to build expressive patches. Now, there is one more item down here called controller, and this is a CC controller. So if we add this, we get this over here. Now here we can set the MIDI CC number, and we also have something else that we don't have with the slider or XY pad, actually slewing and curving the range for the input. If we just check over here, we can see we got linear, exponential, logarithmic. This is just a really nice way of controlling how values are being input, and all of the MIDI sources have this. However, if you want to add MIDI control inside Twin 3, then that's a very easy thing to do because it does have MIDI learn. Now, for those of you who are uninitiated into the world of macros and modulation, a macro is basically when you take one thing and you use that one thing to control a bunch of other things in specific ways. So we're talking directions, we're talking ranges and positions and all kinds of stuff, right? So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna do some manual macro building here. We're gonna press the plus sign, add a slider, and in this case, it works like this. So we slide it from bottom to up, and it basically gives you the minimum value down here and maximum up here. And we can see that in the light to up here. Now, to actually start modulating something, what I usually do is I put the slider at the maximum value because I want to see the maximum range of where my modulation is. And the next thing we're going to do is simply just move a filter. Now, we can do it by moving the main cutoff knob or the main peak. But I'm gonna do something more intricate. I am going to pan the filter. So we're gonna drop it right here, and then we get this little thing here. Now, here we can set up a specific value, and we can even long press and type in our values if we wanted to do that. But what I'm gonna do is just drag it, and this is why I've put the slider at the maximum, because if I pull the slider down, we can see that we wouldn't be able to see how much we're actually modulating when we are adjusting the value here. So that's why I put it up like this, and now we can see how far we're going. But the cool thing is when we're using other forms of modulation sources to do this. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna press here, press up here, and say delete all. And that way we've removed all the modulation setups. Now, the next thing we're going to do is press plus and then add an LFO. Now here, we're going to take the LFO and do the same thing. Go up to the filter, go into this box and drop it on the panning, and it starts modulating. Now we can set up the strength here like this and get it to modulate more. But we're gonna do something even cooler. I'm gonna drag this down completely, meaning we're removing the modulation of the LFO for the filter padding. However, the setup is still there. And what we're gonna do next is drag from the slider to this. We can either do it like this, or if we close down this, we can go from the slider directly to the LFO we've used, and we'll get the setup box right here too with all the modulations in it, and drop it right on the panning. And now we can set up the strength of this modulation ourselves, meaning when I drag the slider up here, we can see how the modulation increases because we're controlling how much the LFO is actually affecting this. And at the same time, what we're gonna do is we're gonna drag from here and go down to the speed dial or to the rate. Drop it here too. We're not gonna do it that fast, but this means that we are now controlling the amount of panning that the LFO is doing on the filter, and we're also controlling the speed of the LFO. So the speed is gonna increase as we go up higher and higher. Now, another cool thing is that we can flip things around. So if we open up the modulation here and we go to the filter panning, and if we press the plus sign here and it becomes a minus, the filter is now moving the other way. And if we go in here and press here where we have a green dot, we can see the modulation from the slider controlling the speed or the rate of the LFO. Well, we can flip that around too, making it so that the higher we pull it, the slower the modulation gets. Now, the cool thing is that we can build macros upon macros upon macros. What we're gonna do next is just remove all of the modulations here. And next, what we're gonna do is add an envelope. Now, we're gonna take the LFO again, and we're gonna add it to the panning. And next, we're gonna take the envelope and add that on top of that. And we want to be able to control the amount of LFO modulation with the envelope only. So we're gonna remove this from the LFO, and now it stops, right? But we're controlling the amount with the envelope. So if I just increase the attaQ a little bit, increase the decay a little bit, and just make it fall down, then the modulation will start happening as it moves higher and higher up to the attaQ point, and then it will drop as it goes into the decay stage. And the cool thing is that we can also add a little bit of envelope modulation for the rate. Now, the next cool thing we can do is to control the actual envelope itself. You see, these points are modulatable, and that goes for the amp envelope too. So we can take this and we can drag it over here to the attaQ. We can drag it over to the decay. We can drag it over to the release also, like this. And this way we can now control the time domain. So let's pull down here and here. And so when the slider is down at the minimum, we have a short envelope. And as we drag it up, we get a longer one. And we can do the same thing for the amp up here if we wanted to. Now, one quick thing to highlight here is that this modulation is happening per voice or per note. Okay, so right now we're using a slider, and if we look down here, we can see that we have another menu if we press this little downwards icon. And here we can switch the slider out for an XY pad, but we're not going to do that. We're going to look at these two options here. As you can see, we got positive selected right now. It goes from 0 to 1, meaning from minimum value down here to maximum value up here. However, we can switch this out for a centered version, meaning it goes from -1 to 0 to +1. Now, we're going to use this behavior. However, what we're going to do first is we're going to switch this out for an XY pad instead. And here we're going to use the X coordinates to switch or blend between two different effects. So we're going to take X, we're going to drag it to reverb. We're going to make sure that reverb is on and pull down, and then I'm going to increase this scaling. And next I'm going to add X again to the delay. Only here I'm going to flip the values around so it goes the other way. Here's another cool thing. You see, if you've built a macro, then you might want to control that macro with a knob. As long as you've got a MIDI controller connected to Twin 3, all we have to do is to press MIDI learn, and then we just go here and press here in this yellow area, and here we've activated this for MIDI learn. The next thing I'm going to do is to move the knob here on my MIDI controller, and there we go. Now this thing is mapped. I'm going to deactivate MIDI learn, and as you can see, I'm now able to move this macro with my knob, which is wonderful. Pro tip number 1, save a lot. But I'm not just talking about presets like sounds. I'm talking about shapes, especially if you're working with the XLFO. Remember that all the modulation sources here have a preset browser. So if there's a shape that you're constantly recreating, be efficient, give it a name, and load it whenever you need it. Gives you more time to be creative with other things. For instance, here I've got a shape that I'm using to modulate pitch with. I'm using this shape in particular because it kind of gives you the feeling of having a tape wobbling effect. And in fact, if you buy my preset pack, you'll hear that a lot of the presets have something like this in it. And I've even put 2 templates in there with 2 different types of tape wobble, all tied to the modulation wheel, so you can set the strength of that pitch wobble. My second pro tip has to do with balancing amplitudes. For instance, if you are doing modulation for a drive, chances are that the sound is going to get louder and louder, and you might want to limit that. And of course, you can put on the limiter in here, compressor in here, but an easy way of doing this is actually by just modulating the volume the other way so it gets turned down as you're tweaking the drive up. Another trick to that can be when you're modulating filters sometimes and you're using steep Q points. You can use the same type of modulation you're using to drive that point. You can use that to also drive volumes and other things like that, just to keep stuff balanced. And that way you won't have to change how your sound sounds by using limiters and compressors. It's just a great way of balancing amplitudes. My third pro tip for Twin 3 is, since the modulation system is so modular and it actually lets you stack modulation on top of modulation, and you can modulate all of the slots, like a tree downwards like this, then use that to your advantage. For instance, you can use randomness to control strengths of other modulations. Like here, for instance, here I've got an LFO controlling the filter. And I am using keyboard tracking to control the strength of this modulation. But I want this to be random. So I can just go here and add another LFO and make this into a slewed random signal and use this to control the strength of the keyboard tracking. So now this one is conditional on this one, and then there's randomness thrown in there. It's a great way of making your patches sound random in a good, controlled way. And if you, in the end, want to control all of it, you can just add a slider or a modulation wheel to it and control the strength of all of it just by doing that. Yeah, conditional modulation is great. Twin 3 by FabFilter is not for everybody because it expects the user to be interested in sound design, and it expects you to want to do sound design. It gives you a sandbox and says, go do whatever you want. And I absolutely love that stuff. But for a beginner, it might be confusing. In an initialized preset, nothing is really wired up. What you have is the controls for the oscillator section, where you can do a bit of synthesis. And then, of course, you have two knobs for the filter section, which is usually enough in a synth. And then there's the effect controls, and it sounds like a lot, but for simple things like adding an LFO to your filter or an envelope or anything else, those basic connections that you usually find in other synthesizers where these functions are hardwired, they're not here in Twin 3. Because it expects you to want to do that work, to want to sound design. Now, I do realize that I'm making all of this sound really, really bad, as if I'm almost trying to tell you not to get this synth. But remember, all of that work you have to do, you get to do it with a great system. Drag and drop, drag and drop, drag and drop, drag and drop. Click over here to flip it around, drag over here to flip it around. It is great. It is super fast. And on top of that, the modulation sources are really powerful. The envelopes are of a DAD-Sahur type with curvable slopes, and all of the nodes are modulatable. And the XLFO is called XLFO for a reason. It's more than an LFO. You can make any type of waveform you can dream up. And on top of that, it also doubles up as a step sequencer, and it can have its output be quantized to pitch. Plus, it's also modulatable. And then on top of all of that, you get to mess around with polarity everywhere. Polarity is just fluid in Twin 3, which is great when you want to do sound design. Now, there is an elephant with a broom. And, did you drop the broom? You see, Twin 3 is a heavy plugin. In fact, all of FabFilter's plugins are very, very heavy and will take a lot of resources from your system. And that is the drawback of sounding great. They're using oversampling and other tricks that takes a lot of hardware resources from your system in order to sound great, which is why modulating the time domain for their delays and reverbs doesn't sound like crap. On top of that, Twin 3 can do up to 64 voices polyphony, and you can have modulation going on when you're doing that. That will take a serious amount of resources. Every note you add and play at the same time on a synth takes more and more resources from your system. So you need to consider that, especially if you're using an older iDevice. Now, Twin 3 is not perfect, and you already heard two of my biggest bits of criticism for the synthesizer in the critique section. However, I have one more. There are some stuff missing. What do I mean by that? Well, it's FabFilter, right? So I expect FabFilter to add some really great tools in here, and I want more synthesis. One thing I would want for an upgraded version of Twin 3 or maybe Twin 4 is quad ring modulation with attenuation. And another thing I would want is phase modulation or frequency modulation. And the next thing I would want is a more expansive drive section. Because sure, there's a lot of variety when you tweak the knob, but my most favorite plugin that FabFilter has ever made is Saturn II. And I just wish that the drive section in Twin 3 was a little bit more expansive. So giving me a way to switch out the cab simulations, adding some different distortions, doing wave folding, something along those lines would be great. How about an IR loader? I mean, come on, just give me some options, bro. So my final verdict for Twin 3 is haQ attaQ approved. It's a great synthesizer if you're using this. Yeah, if you're an iOS user and you're expecting this to feel great with touch, get that thought out of your skull now. And I would recommend this because this is way cheaper. It's very cheap getting a wireless mouse like this. Mine is an older one that has this little dongle that I put into my USB hub. So yeah, I'm good to go. I want to thank you so much for watching my video. And if you watched all of it, go seek a doctor. And thank you so much for being such a wonderful supporter. Now again, if you decided to pick up Twin 3 after watching this video, why don't you go and check out the preset pack that I made for it over at my Gumroad. You can find a link down in the pinned comment. And for those of you who watched my video on the Buzz Zone synthesizer from Toybox Audio, remember to check out my Neuro preset pack, which I realize it's not for everyone. I mean, it's like some horrid sounding sounds in there. It's not your regular synth sounds, but it's the kind of stuff I like doing. So it was very much fun doing it. It's a pack of 70 Neuro drum and bass type sounds. Yeah, go check them out. As usual, I wish you a very productive week. Now go finger all of your stuff and have a lot of fun doing it.
It's a move. It's not you. Just a move. Just a move. It's not you. Just a move. It's a move.